Good evening. I'm Katie Dunn, an educational counselor here at Prep Matters, and I am delighted to welcome you all to tonight's town hall meeting. We truly would like this to feel like a town hall, just as if we were all in the same room. So throughout the webinar, we invite you to please use the Q&A function to ask questions of our wonderful panelists. You will also see that you have the option of upvoting a question to emphasize that you are interested in the answer. I am joined today by my colleague, Jeff Knox, Director of Educational Planning at Prep Matters, and Jeff and I will keep a close eye on the Q&A box so we can guide the conversation. We know you have many questions about college and college admissions, even more so this year than ever. And I am so pleased to welcome our guest this evening, Jeff Selingo, author, thinker, observer, and all-around leader in educational journalism. Jeff Selingo has written about higher ed for 2 decades. He is the author of 2 New York Times bestsellers, a contributor to The Atlantic and The Washington Post, a special advisor at Arizona State University, and was recently a visiting scholar at Georgia Tech's Center for 21st Century Universities. His next book, Who Gets In and Why? A Year Inside College Admissions, will be published in just about 3 weeks by Simon Schuster. And for everyone on this call today, Mr. Selingo is offering a special 30% off pre-order discount on the new book, Who Gets In and Why. Use the code BOOK30 at checkout, and it's on the screen. And don't worry, I will come back to that at the end of the webinar as well. That code does expire tomorrow, so I want to make sure you have it. So Jeff, many of us would love to spend a year, I think, embedded in the world of college admissions. What was the thing that was most surprising to you?
Well, first of all, thanks for having me, Katie. It's great to be here and great to have the audience we have tonight. So probably what really surprised me the most was just how deep and wide the admissions pools are at these selective colleges. So for the book, I was at 3 selective colleges, University of Washington, Davidson College, and Emory University in Atlanta. And I'll never forget when I was kind of starting the process. I remember a few years ago, after I wrote a column for the Post, a parent in the Bethesda area wrote me a note basically saying she couldn't believe that her child was denied by almost all the schools that she applied to, and the counselors were surprised as well. And then talked about other applicants from that high school. And it was that moment that I walked in and I spent time with these admissions officers that you start to realize, just how big this country is, and then you add the rest of the world in, right? So, we have 43,000 high schools in the US. Now, most selective colleges are not getting applicants from 43,000, but, I have this stat in the book that, most selective colleges might be getting upwards of applications from 10,000 high schools. So just think about how deep and wide the senior classes in the high school your son or daughter goes to. And that's really kind of what's being replicated across the country and in some ways across the world. And I tell folks this not to increase your anxiety, right? And not to frustrate you, but to just really understand that these selective schools aren't just picking students from, your kid's high school or your high school, or maybe, 10 other schools like it, but thousands of high schools like it. And each of these schools might be sending, 10 or 15 applicants just like them. And that was the part that I didn't appreciate, just how deep and wide these pools are. And of course, remember, Emory, the year I was there, got over 30,000 applications for, a couple thousand spots, right? So we're talking about a lot of applications for a small number of spots.
You talk a little bit, you call it, I think, harsh math, the number of applications that, particularly when we get into thinking about the different deadlines. But one of the things that I found really interesting as I was taking different notes throughout the book is you say that teenagers spend months, even years, crafting a college application. And then, as I witnessed, it might get reviewed in just 8 minutes, which itself is kind of a terrifying thought. But here's the secret. That might still be fairer than the old way. As a counselor and as an educator, I would love to hear your insight into what those two what those two different ways look like.
So one of the things that a number of selective schools moved to a couple of years ago was something that it's called committee-based evaluation. So it used to be back in the day, probably when many of today's parents applied to college, that you would apply to, even selective colleges, there would be a single reader who would do the first read of the application, make a decision. There would usually be a second reader, and then many of those applications, not all though, would go to a committee decision. And that's how the decisions were made. And everybody follows kind of a slightly different process, but that was essentially, one reader, two readers committee. Now, what happened though a couple of years ago is that, and this started at the University of Pennsylvania, is that institutions were getting overwhelmed with applications. I just mentioned Emory, 30,000 applications, and those numbers were just growing. So 4 years ago, Emory was closer to 20,000. So the numbers were just growing exponentially over the years. And so what they decided to do was move to this committee-based evaluation, which now about 50 or 60 schools use, mostly the selective schools. And what they do is they have two people read the application. They have what they call a pilot and a co-pilot, and the pilot usually is the more senior admissions officer, and they're really looking at half the application, and the co-pilot's looking at the other half. They split the application in half. One's usually looking at the school-based stuff, so transcript, recommendations, where the other person's looking more at the student side of things, essays, other parts of the application that the student completed. And then they have a discussion about it. And so why this is, so it moves faster as a result, because they're splitting the application in half. And why this is fairer is because I think it sometimes takes bias out of the process, because you're getting two perspectives at the same time. Somebody might see something in one part of the application that the other person doesn't see. They're having a lot more conversation about it. As I said, it's usually a more senior admissions officer paired with a more junior admissions officer. They're coming with different perspectives. So yes, it might be faster, but it may be fairer compared to the old way, where the first reader might just not like the person for some reason, and they get tossed out of the pool.
Well, and I think you mentioned, and I think we all are aware in our own lives that, like, sometimes I'm having a bad day, or I have a headache, or I'm tired, or it's raining, and I may not bring the freshest, kindest eyes to the application read. So it strikes me as this is one of those moments where then my partner would be able to say, wow, Kate, yesterday you were responding very differently to our applications. Do we maybe want to take a minute? I mean, it might just be nice to have some of the more overt biases that can come in as well. We have a question from our audience that I think makes a lot of sense. In this scenario, is there typically a role that the regional admissions officer might play in terms of being the pilot or the co-pilot? We often, a number of schools, we know they read by region. Could you walk us through that a little bit?
Yeah, and so it's a very good question. And so they're still reading by region. And so usually the pilot is the head of that regional committee. And usually the co-pilot, by the way, is part of that region as well. So the two people really know that region really well. And the pilot, because they've worked in that, at Emory, somebody who's worked in the New York City region, for example, has done New York City for decades, really familiar with the schools. Now, so that's what the interesting thing, though, and I point this out in the book, is that even though this is a consistent way of looking at applicants, how they apply it then might be inconsistent. So one of the things, and this is again the unfairness of the system overall, and I point this out in the book. So sometimes the co-pilot and pilot might talk about the applicant immediately. They might jump right into the application and start talking about it. Sometimes they might read in silence. And so I saw this sometimes where they'll read in silence for a couple of minutes and then they'll dive in and start asking questions. So how they apply this committee-based evaluation is a system, but how they apply it in the room really depends on how a pilot and co-pilot want to work. And the other point about this is that the pilot and co-pilot could change every day. So where you end up in the system, on Monday it might be these two people. On Tuesday it might be two different people. So they're changing constantly through the process. So as I remind people throughout the book, admissions is inherently unfair. And I think we just kind of have to accept that because it is a human process. If we want some sort of electronic process, then we have to give it up to the AI, the artificial intelligence and the computers to do it. But otherwise, it is an inherently unfair process.
Well, and one of the things I often say to families, one of the things I often say to families is that I think we can all agree the world might be a better place if there wasn't a role for my job. I love my job, but maybe if the system made a little more sense, we wouldn't need to have it. But one of the things we also talk about a lot is I would have predicted 15 years ago, 10 years ago, 20 years ago, when we saw both a rise in applications overall with the Common App portal, with uncertainties about financial aid, and an increased use of data science everywhere, all over everything, including college admissions. I would have anticipated that we would be going far more quickly to sort of an AI model. It gives me a little bit of comfort when I'm working with students that there is still a place here for someone can read your essay and get who you are and understand what you would bring to their campus. I think that puts both a lot of power in a student hand. I mean, it really, on the one hand, like my SATs and certainly this year, my SATs are out of my hands, but in general, my SATs or my grades are in my authority, but a little bit not. But my essays are something I can really own. And so I think it does in some ways kind of empower the student, even though it certainly causes a great deal of
Well, and the admissions counselors, they know the context, right, that they're in. And so, many of these counselors have been to these high schools. They might have met these students either at the high school visit or on a campus visit. And so they're able to bring a context to the process that at some point, a computer can. And I remember asking Stephen Farmer, who's head of admissions at UNC Chapel Hill, this question, right? What if a computer could one day take your job? And he said, there's something about us, yes, even when you're denied, there's something to know, there's something that is comforting in knowing that it was a group of humans or a couple of humans on the other side that made that decision, and it wasn't made simply by a computer.
Some unknowing machine.
Yes, exactly.
And I also think that it's worth us in thinking about on the personal side of things. If I apply to 15 schools and I know I'm only going to attend one, then I'm also a part of what is complicated about this system. I'm also a part of what the numbers that the student applications create is part of what makes this challenging for the institution.
Exactly, because they need to know at some point who's going to enroll. And so some institutions, as many parents and students know, take demonstrated interest into account in the admissions decisions. I talk about this specifically in the context of Davidson College, right, which has this thing they called LTE throughout the process, which calls likelihood to enroll. Mm-hmm. And what they want to know is they try to, through reading the application, and many schools are even much more sophisticated about this using data science, how many emails have you opened? How often have you visited? They want to know if we send out an acceptance to you, knowing that we know that you've also applied to 5 or 10 or 12 other schools, how likely are you to enroll? Because we're not going to, quote unquote, waste an acceptance on you because we want to keep our yield numbers up. We're not going to waste and our acceptance rate low. We're not going to waste an acceptance on you. And I think one of the problems, and I point this out in the book, is that parents and students have kind of gotten smart to this. I point out in the book somebody who applied to Tulane, which uses demonstrated interest, and the parent knew that her son was away at summer camp. Obviously, this is years ago, away at summer camp, and she opened up every single one of her son's emails from Tulane, knowing they were tracking that while he was away at summer camp. So sometimes we could kind of fake out those data pieces.
What I always tell students is, I don't think it's worth trying to game this system because we don't really know how and what they are tracking, although we have some ideas. But students today have spent their entire lives with the adults in their world saying, don't leave anything on the internet. It lives forever. You're never going to get a job. And so kids are actually very good at covering their digital footprint. And so my reminder is just sort of, so don't do that anymore. Let people know if you're interested.
And schools really want to know that. They really want to know that it does come into account at some institutions, especially at those final moments where they're, and I know we'll probably talk about this at some point tonight, where they're shaping the class and they really have to determine, they kind of want you, but they really want to know if you want them, right? This is, at the end of the day, it's a match. Right. And as you said, the more colleges that students have applied to over the years, it's made this much more difficult to predict who's actually going to enroll.
And at the same time that that number has increased, that the student applications have increased since maybe the mid 80s or early 90s, US News and World Report has also increased, has started ranking and has become such a critical part, I think, of many families' searches, for better or worse. Even when folks know that those are flawed lists in some ways, it is comforting as a human to have some lists. It feels in this kind of process, you know, families want there to be an algorithm. They want to understand what these numbers mean. And so when you mention yield, do you want to walk our audience through why yield matters so much to universities in light of the US News and World Report rankings?
Yeah, so they want to know, essentially, yield it shows the popularity of a college campus. So really the two numbers that selective colleges really want to hit on is a low acceptance rate. So they're accepting very few students who actually apply, and then a high percentage of those students who yield. And you know, even people say no to Harvard, although their yield is very good, right? I think it's 75% plus, right? But you know, but even at the very selective colleges, their yield might only be in the 30 to 40% range, right? Which might seem low, but that means they have to accept so many more students in order to hit that class, because they know only about a third to half are even saying yes to them. I describe this in the book as invitations to a wedding. You send out invitations to a wedding knowing some people are going to RSVP no. And so you're always trying to calculate that equilibrium that you want to reach in terms of your guests. And that's exactly what colleges are doing. They're sending out, the acceptances are essentially invitations to join a class. And what they're trying to figure out is, among those invitations, who's going to say yes?
Who's likely to say yes?
Yeah.
You know, interesting, this year, one of the questions that I've been receiving a lot, that I'm sure you have been receiving all the time, is what happens to those yield predictions and kind of enrollment management questions for the universities in a global pandemic? You know, we've heard everybody's going to stay home, everybody's going to take a gap year. International students certainly are not all coming back. And variations on, this means nobody in the class of 2021 will have a spot, or everybody will have it easier because they're panicked. Do you have any sense from what you're observing with colleges, how some of that will play out in the next cycle?
Yeah, so I think there's two things that are going to happen where there's going to have impact. So I get this question all the time. Well, if all these students defer, I think Harvard announced a couple of weeks ago that 30% of its freshman class deferred. Does that mean there's going to be that many fewer spots in next year? Now, you have to remember that for most schools, what they're really looking at is their overall enrollment. So what that means is if 30% of this freshman class defers, that means next year's sophomore class will be smaller as a result. And what they'll probably do is make and this is what I speculate they're going to do, because I don't think anybody knows yet, is they're going to increase the size of their freshman class next year, as long as they feel like they have capacity in individual course sections. But they really want to keep their overall enrollment high, or the same level. So I highly doubt that a large number of deferrals this year is really going to impact next year's freshman class. Where I think it's going to impact is, I think it's just going to be probably larger than normal among that. So that's one impact. The second impact, I think, is on early decision. So one of the interesting findings in the book is that I looked at the history of early decision, which goes back to all the way to the 1950s. But one of the interesting things that happened in early decision happened in 2008. And for those of us who've lived through the Great Recession of 2008, we remember it hit in the fall of 2008. And up until 2008, even the selective colleges maybe only took about a quarter of their class early decision. So early decision meaning, you apply by November 1, it's a binding decision that you get in December, and then you end up, applying there, and your college search is over. But they only took about 25% of their class early decision. What happened in the fall of 2008 when that recession hit is that colleges were really nervous about making their class, about how much their class would cost in terms of financial aid. So presidents and CFOs went to their admissions deans and said, let's have more certainty now in this class, and let's increase the percentage of students we're taking early. So that year, a number of colleges went from 25% closer to 50%, meaning they took more than, up to half their students early. Now, what's interesting is that when the economy started to come back, we didn't see those numbers drop. So over the last decade plus, selective colleges, 30, 40, some cases 50+%. Davidson, the year I was there, almost 60%, I think, around of their class came in early decision. So what I'm interested to see this fall is, again, I think institutions are going to want to have certainty in a very uncertain world. And so what they're what they're going to say is, hey, let's try to push those numbers up higher. Now, in some cases, they can't really push them up that much higher. If you're already at 60 in your selective college, your pool just may not be strong enough in early to push it up to 70. But if you're at 40, could you push it up to 45? Could you push it up to 50? I think so. And I think that's where we're going to see this happen. And what's interesting about this, Katie, is that this is going to be a tension, I think, this fall, because on the other side, I'm talking to students, I'm talking to parents, I'm talking to counselors who really want colleges to push their early decision deadlines off, right? They don't want that November 1st, right? They can't test, right? They're not in school to get counselor recommendations and things like that. So they really want early decision pushed off maybe to December 1 or whatever. So we're going to have this tension. And I think it's, I'm talking to deans and I'm saying, are you going to move your early decision deadline? Nobody wants to be the first, of course, because it's a very competitive market. So I think everybody's waiting, if they're going to push their early decision deadline off, for another college to do it. But one way or the other, I think that most colleges are really going to try to up their numbers in early decision this year.
I absolutely agree. And I have been asking that same question of every dean I've talked to for months and getting those same answers. And what is surprising to me, and I think really speaks to the uncertainty that colleges are feeling right now, is we did see early deadlines move after 9/11, after Hurricane Katrina. Other times when we have had real disruptions, particularly to the testing calendar, but in general to students' lives, and even less nationally, that is one tool that colleges sort of led with. And I've been surprised that we haven't seen more of that, and I suspect you're right. It speaks to the real uncertainty colleges are feeling. I also, when Princeton made their announcement a couple weeks ago that they were just eliminating their early deadline entirely and moving their deadline to everybody applies regular, which probably means we should all send some cookies to their admissions team in January and February. But I wonder if maybe that opens some doors, because certainly students are also feeling, I think, a real stretch about committing to an early decision school this year when so many students have not been able to visit campuses.
Yeah, and I think Princeton could do that because it's in a rarefied market, right? So this is all very competitive, right? All these deadlines, everybody has ED. A lot of schools have ED2 that are well positioned after their overlap schools. People hear back from those decisions, right? So this is truly a competitive system, and so I think everybody's waiting for somebody else. And so once that happens, if somebody else kind of is the first mover on early decision, you're going to see some others follow. I thought I would have seen it by now because we're coming up on the end of August. At some point, they're going to have to tell people this. So my advice to folks, if they're thinking about applying early and they're wondering if those deadlines are going to change, you just keep moving forward like it won't change, because they may not announce it. And so you can't go on that assumption that they're going to move these deadlines back. And I think the fact that many of these schools move test optional means that that's not the thing they're waiting for, right? I thought, well, if there's widespread testing cancellations in September by the ACT and SAT, then they would have to move their early decision deadlines back. But now that many of those schools also went test optional, that's kind of they kind of threw that out the window.
I thought that too. And schools some surprising schools who have openly really relied on testing in a lot of their admissions in the past have said, this year we get it, that's not where you are. Let's talk about test optional for a minute. We have some questions in the chat. Certainly another thing I get asked about a lot. And one of the things that I've been trying to get at with a number of admissions teams, and I would love your insight, is so many of these schools that have moved to test optional admissions, like Davidson, previously already had a holistic admissions process. Right. They were already looking at all the pieces. So for their readers and for kind of counselors as they work with students and for families, what changes do we think we'll really see in kind of a concrete way to how those applications are read if there's not a test score?
So it's really important to remember that testing is important, but it was never the most important thing that application readers looked at. The most, and you can tell this from surveys of admissions officers. So this is not just at the 3 schools that I looked at, but high school grades and high school curriculum matter the most. And if you look at the surveys that NACAC, which is the Association of College Admissions Officers, they do a survey every year of admissions officers about what matters most. It's always grades and curriculum matter more than test scores. Test scores are always number 3.
If anyone has attended any webinar that Jeff Knox and I have done in the past 2 years, they've seen that chart because we use it a lot.
Yeah, exactly, right? But no matter how many times you tell parents that and students, they still think that test scores matter more. And so what I saw in the schools that I watched, all 3 were using test scores the year I was there. It was always kind of like a check-in. If they were unsure. So if they're unfamiliar with the high school, for example, or something didn't quite make sense on the curriculum, maybe the curriculum wasn't strong enough, or the grading was all over the place, right? So admissions officers love grades that are consistent or on an upward trend. They don't like this, and they definitely don't like this, right? Downward trend or what they call spiky trend.
Right.
And so if there was a student that they particularly liked for that reason, they then would go into the testing and take a deeper dive into it. But the fact of the matter is there's a lot of consistency around testing and grades. The College Board has found this in their own studies. 60% of scores and grades, of 60% of students in one study, their scores and grades were immensely consistent, meaning they had high scores and high grades. It's really that other 40% where you may have some inconsistencies, meaning they have really good high school grades but low test scores, or they have really high test scores and low high school grades. Those are the students where testing might help hurt you in some cases, right? So I think some people are happy that it's test optional this year because they're just not good test takers. And then there's the other case where testing might actually help you get into a more competitive school. But at the end of the day, testing was always something that I felt was like, I call that a balance wheel in the book, where they kind of balanced it against what else they were seeing in the application. In some cases, they never really even looked at it very much.
I sometimes tell students that's a great way to think about AP scores or subject test scores, is that it sort of demonstrates I learned this material, not just I charmed my teacher.
Right.
And so it just kind of gives you a little bit of outside authority to that. No, not to spin conspiracy theories, because that's not the kind of town hall this is. But there are, I think there's a wide variety of language that colleges are using when they talk about what they mean this year in particular about test optional.
Yeah.
And we recently saw a strong statement from NACAC, which you've mentioned, about testing.
Test optional means test optional, right?
Right. And we had a webinar with Andrew Moe from Swarthmore, who said, let me be clear, don't take those tests. Right. Don't leave your house. Don't put yourself at risk. But there are other schools that we've certainly seen that say, like, if you were not able to get tested in your region, then it's okay if you don't send them. But if you were, we expect to see test scores. So from the sort of anxious family point of view, when you are making those choices, is it safe? Is it healthy for my family to try to find a test date for my child? How seriously should we be reading into those things?
I think, first of all, a lot will be decided in the next couple of weeks. If we're going to have, the SAT, College Board added a date in September, we have a bunch of dates in September. I think if there is widespread cancellation in September of those dates, you're going to have to see many more colleges, because there's some colleges that are still requiring them at the state level. I think you're going to have to see many more colleges step back from that. My advice to students is this: like, if you can take a test, great. If you can't, then maybe just look at the test optional schools on your list, because there's enough of them this year that I think you're going to have a great selection of schools. And there's so much mistrust about this, because I hear this from parents all the time. Well, they say it's test optional, but it really isn't. I did a webinar with Andy Palumbo at WPI, Worcester Polytechnic Institute in Massachusetts, which went test optional way back in 2007. And one of the points he made is that 80% of students still submit tests, right? So when parents see that, they will always find that example, because I hear this all the time. Well, Johnny down the street, and my daughter had the same, grades and everything else the same in high school. They had a test score. My daughter didn't. He got in, she didn't. Right. And I keep saying there's so many other reasons why one gets in and one doesn't. Right. It is not, I remind people in the book that it's not a zero-sum game. Right. We're not comparing student A to student B. Going back to my earlier point, these are such wide and deep pools that they're really comparing, bunches of students at a time, not just one and one.
Well, and I think that, the image that many of us have, and I've been doing this professionally for a long time, and it's still hard to shake this image. The image you have of admissions is everybody sitting around a table and kind of talking about these kids. And that has not been the reality for the vast majority of applications for many, many years. But that's where those pieces come in. Let's jump to a way less obnoxious question, something a little more fun. We have a lot of questions here in our chat. And one of them is, given this year you were able to spend, I assume you also were able to look at these applications and kind of experience them along with the readers. Does any particular essay or story stand out to you from this time?
So I will say the essays are numbingly similar. I mean, really, they kind of numb you after a while. And to be honest with you, that's why the essay doesn't take on as much prominence as I think sometimes parents and students give it. And so, and now this may change this year, right? So admissions officers may lean in a little bit more to the essay this year. It's really about being authentic. I think sometimes students are trying too hard. So I always tell students, a slice of life, somebody, one of the essays I mentioned in the book, there would always be these lunch breaks, right? So we would read applications in the morning at some of these schools, then we would have and gather for lunch. And over lunch, sometimes admissions officers would talk about the favorite essay they read that morning. And I remember there was one on somebody was afraid of going to school, was going to miss home because there was a discussion in their house about whether to have pulp or no pulp in the orange juice in the morning. And they were talking about how much they would miss home because of that argument about pulp and no pulp in the orange juice, right? It was like a simple little thing, but written really powerfully with great, just a great writing that really made it come alive. There was another essay that I remember folks talking about where the applicant discovered kind of bargain hunting while shopping for his mom one day, right? She sent him out to the store and he realized he was really trying to it was almost like supermarket sweep, right? Trying to get as many, items in for how much money she gave him that day, right? So it's like these little things, and where I think students try too hard, they're not authentic in that essay. And I have a feeling we're going to see a lot of that this year, right? We're going to see a lot of COVID-related essays. And my advice is don't write about it unless it really impacted you, right? Don't think you have to have an essay about that because you lived through it.
Well, one of the things I say to students that I'm going to say now in hopes that you tell me that I'm right and everybody hears it is, for the most part, when you're 17, you haven't done a lot yet. Not a lot of things have happened yet, and that's cool. That's okay. And so for those students, as you say, who really try hard to have an essay that is incredibly tight and structured and formal, it often, I think, becomes a little inauthentic. And I find that I just personally am more drawn to those essays that sometimes are a little bit unfinished. They're a little messy. They have some insight, but they're still grappling with what that insight might mean, because that's actually part of the process of going to college, is continuing to grapple with that insight.
And remember, the essay, this is one of the things, and I point this out in the book, make sure that the essay is part of your application should tell a complete story about you as a person for that institution. And what I think has happened over the years, and I saw this I followed, as you know, from reading the book early, I followed a group of high school students as well. So a large group of high school students, I profiled 3 of them in the book as I follow their college process. And what I saw in those students I followed is that because they're applying to 8 or 10 or 12 schools, they kind of see them as one big bunch. maybe they have an early decision school, but then everything else they're applying in one big bunch. And, they have a big Google Doc and they're working on different essays and they're cutting and pasting from different essays. And so their story lacks some cohesion as a result.
Mhm.
And what happens then is on the other side, and I remind readers of this all the time, college admissions officers are not detectives. They're not there to try to figure out things, right? They don't have enough time.
Right.
And so what they're doing is they're reading this application. So what might happen, and would happen a lot, is a counselor or a teacher would talk about a student in their recommendation and would talk about the passion the student had for X or Y, this club or this sport or reading something. And you would see no other evidence of that in the application, right? It was almost like the student kind of forgot to list that as an activity in some cases, or didn't talk about it in his essay.
Right.
So think about your application as a package: essay, recommendations, activities, all that stuff. It should tell a story about you as an applicant, and then match it up to what the school wants, right? Why, this is a small liberal arts college, or this is a big research university. Why do you want to be here? Like, what about your story matches up to our story as an institution? And you have to think about those as single matches, not I'm applying to 10 or 12 schools that are very different. And I'm going to cut and paste from all these different applications to hand that in. And that to me is what I want to remind students of constantly. Think of your story, the story you're going to tell to Boston College, the story you're going to tell to the University of Maryland, the story you're going to tell to Emory or Davidson or whoever it is.
And I often tell kids, you know that you are not the same person as the 4 kids who sit next to you in English class. So I don't want your application to look like their 4 applications. We want to be able to see you, so that, because colleges are pretty good at knowing who will be successful on their campus. They work hard on that end of the process. So give them as much as you can. And as you said, don't make them guess.
Yeah. And I think there's so much shaping of applications now before they go in. And it was interesting going back to that point about how deep and wide these pools are. There was a day, in late January, early February, when I was at Emory, and we're sitting there, and we're just going application after application. And it seems like everybody had a 1490 on the SAT, and everybody had a 4 point whatever, and everybody took 12 AP. I was like, there were moments when I would say, didn't we just see this application like 2 applications ago? Oh, no. And then 2 applications from now, we would see almost the same thing. It was like, after a while, they just seemed all the same. And again, I think part of that is about, I think applicants think too much about what do the schools want to see. They read all these different sites. They say, oh, well, I have to have 12 APs. I have to have 10, they have to have all these activities and things like that. And really what they're looking for is somebody who just followed their passions, did what really mattered to them in high school. And I keep telling people, even in the midst of this pandemic, control what you can control, and let all the other chips fall where they may, because there's so many things you can't control in this process, including, by the way, now in the midst of a pandemic.
Right. And what a great lesson for life for a 17 or 18-year-old to learn, that the energy you put into things you can't control is energy you take away from things that you can.
Right. And you can. And there's so many things you can control in the process, by like the courses you take, the grades you have, the activities you participate in. So there are things you can control in this process. Focus on those and focus less on what you think they want to see.
I want to get to the shaping of class question, but you mentioned the students that you followed, and I really liked the way you particularly kind of set up some of the differences between their searches. When I was in school and then now outside school as a counselor, that is a piece that I hear a lot about. And what I hear is a lot of students, and my own niece is a senior in high school now, so I've been hearing a lot at home. Poor thing, has 2 aunts who are college counselors. So she has been saying, among others, my mom keeps saying, well, go research colleges. And I have no idea what that means. And so you talk a lot about kind of a bigger funnel and a smaller funnel. Can you give us some advice for students who are at any point in this process about how you see that benefiting them?
Yeah, so one of the things I talk about in the book, both colleges and students have funnels. So colleges, they send out tons of mail to students, either snail mail or email, and they have hundreds of thousands of people in that funnel, and eventually it comes in, and it comes down into a narrow funnel. Students who actually apply, students who get accepted, students who enroll. Students have their own funnel of institutions that they're looking at when they build their list. The problem with students is that I think it's too narrow. They think there's only 15 or 20 schools out there. And I think the rankings play into that. I think living in certain areas of the country where all you hear about are the same schools over and over again, you're kind of in a bubble in your high school. Well, all the students seem to apply to these schools. So what I encourage students to do is to really start much wider, much earlier on. And the first thing to do is forget about the names. What type of college do you want to go to? Do you want to go to an urban institution or a rural institution? Do you want to go to public or private? Do you want to go 4 states away or closer to home? Do you want to go to a small liberal arts college? Do you want to go to a big research university? And when you talk to students, they have no idea what any of those things mean, right? And so I tell them, go down the street, right? I live here in suburban DC, go to University of Maryland, get a sense of what a big public university is, right? Go to, an urban university, go to George Washington and see what an urban university is, right? You could go to some of the liberal arts colleges in Southern Pennsylvania, Dickinson College or Franklin and Marshall, to see what a small liberal arts college will look like, right? That's how I would begin my search. Even if you have no desire, especially if you have time and understanding right now, it's kind of hard to go see those places, but try to get a sense of, is this the type of place I would want to be in? Mm-hmm. That helps you then narrow the search into types of institutions. Then you could start applying names to them. But don't start with, I'm going to look at the US News and World Report rankings, and I'm only going to look at the top 20 schools. And I think that's where I think the search becomes way too narrow, way too quickly for too many students.
The student experience at the top 20 schools are wildly different from one another.
Exactly.
So the same student will not be happy at each of those or successful at each of those schools.
Well, and the fact of the matter is, because these are such selective schools that are inundated with applications, if that's all you look at, and this happens in the book, you're going to unfortunately get denied probably from most of those institutions.
Right.
And so the wider the list you have earlier on, the more diversity you have in that list, the better off you're going to be, and that you're going to have a process that you really grow and enjoy at the end of the day.
And if there's any silver lining of COVID, and I hesitate to use that phrase so flippantly, I do think admissions officers are very available to families right now. Students are able to make connections through a number of virtual options that have gone far beyond the virtual tour. And so students often say to me, like, no, I go on all those tours and they all sound the same. I can't tell. But the student panels sound very different, and the interacting directly with an admissions officer sounds very different. And so I think that there are some opportunities, if you can really leap into that thinking of the big funnel, there are some opportunities right now to find out about some schools that you probably don't know about yet.
No, and in some ways, admissions officers are not going to be, one of the issues I think with COVID this fall is that admissions officers won't be traveling like they normally will, right? They're not going to be making those high school visits like they normally will, but that means they're going to be in their office. They're going to be answering email and calls, and all these admissions officers are usually assigned by regions. So, call them up, email them, I think that also tells you a lot about the institution if they actually answer your emails and get back to you and want to be connected with you. I think you can do the same thing with faculty, because I know that you may not be able to get into see a particular major or see a class when you normally would go to a campus. Try to reach out to them. Try to reach out to current students. There's so much now because of social media and because of the internet in general that you could find people who are similar majors. You could find a lot of these day in the life videos that are posted on YouTube, Reddit, if you want to kind of dive in there. I always warn people about that. But there's so much out there. Yes, be very, but you can find out a lot of information. You could then balance that against what you're seeing from the official channels. Now, I will tell you, I did a webinar recently with college admissions officers, and they would never recommend things like Reddit or YouTube or things like that, because they monitor their official channels. And I think you do both, right? And you kind of get then a 360-degree picture, I think, of the institution by monitoring all of these different channels.
I think there's a lot more of that available right now. So if you have the energy, although I have also tried to caution some students against, don't try to do 8 schools today. Don't try to go to, 4 different Zoom hour-long panels. You wouldn't try and go visit 8 schools in a day in person, and that can really be, I think, overload. So one question that we get a great deal, and I think this probably relates to some of the enrollment management and shaping of the class questions, is all of the very real facts and hard truths and a lot of rumors alongside the things that can tighten the pool for applicants every year. Who has a different hook, who's an athlete or legacy or race and ethnicity, low income, first generation students. I think there's a lot of feelings of, I can't help that my child isn't some of those things. What does that mean for her? What does that mean for her?
And you can't, right? Just because a school has a 25% acceptance rate doesn't mean you have a 1 in 4 chance of getting in.
Exactly.
And you just kind of have to accept that. Again, it's something you can't control. So this is the process at the very end. And this is something also that I didn't quite get until I was inside the process. And I described this at several points in the book. And the Wall Street Journal will be publishing an excerpt from it based on this piece of it, which is around the shaping process. And this is really when the admissions process, in my mind, the entire process is unfair. Let's just agree on that. This is probably when it's the most unfair. And this is the time at the very end when they have to figure out who to send acceptances to. So I described this in the very beginning of the book around Emory, for example. So the year I was there, as I said earlier, they accept so many applicants, but they have models to know who actually will accept those acceptances, who will actually enroll. In the year I was there, in their tentative admit pool, they had 1,000 too many students. So they had tentatively admitted 1,000 too many kids. Now, this is obviously before they send out admissions decisions, right? So this is in early March. So to give you kind of a sense of when this is happening, they're sending out admissions decisions like around March 20th or so. So this is like the first week of March. So it's only a couple weeks before they send out decisions. And it's amazing to me. You could be in the admit pool and 4 weeks later be in the wait list or deny pool, right? That's how fast things move. So what they do at the very end here is this is when they do shape, as they call it, shape the class. And it's all those hooks. It's all those things that either pull somebody up into the acceptance bin or pull somebody down into the rejection bin. They don't like to say rejection, but I will use that term. And it's really those students who are close to the line. And there's a lot of them, right? There's, as I said, there were 1,000 too many. And there's sometimes people who are just on the outside looking in that they pull in. And that's when they're really looking at things like, they look at race and ethnicity. That's when they're looking at gender, a big issue at that point. They're looking at majors. Do we have a nice balance of majors? Do we have geographic balance, right? So one of the things that Emory does is they do their shaping by geography. And because they're in the Southeast, they have more kids from the Southeast applying there, right? So they have to shape out more kids from the Southeast, right? So it's all those little things. Legacy status matters a lot more. So they might say, oh, we have to take this kid because it's legacy status. That's when donations might matter, right? Or other, things that I know at Northwestern, Maury Shapiro, the president there, has talked about, that's when he's like, hey, calling the admissions dean and saying, hey, I've been watching this kid, make sure he gets in, right? That's when those things happen in those last couple of weeks. And they either move people in, out, or that's when they say, you know what, we're going to move them to the wait list. And that's when the wait list just balloons, as I point out in the book. Sometimes the wait list is bigger than the entire class that they're waiting for, because the wait list has just become a way, I think, of letting kids down a little bit easier than just saying you're not coming at all.
Well, I think you point out in the book one admissions officer who said, I wish that kid knew that he was an admin until March 10th.
March 6th or whatever.
Right. And so I think that there are humans on the other side of this desk. And so a wait list says, look, we thought you were great. Yeah. We just didn't.
Well, and admissions officers, I will tell you, admissions officers hate the shaping process because it always comes down to somebody that they remember in reading. And they sometimes have to toss that person aside. And the other thing that happens in shaping, although it didn't happen at Emory, but I described this at Lafayette College in the book, they're need aware, Lafayette is. So meaning they take a student's financial background into consideration. And usually that's also happens in the shaping process where the student is simply too expensive to give out financial aid, and they decide it's better to deny them admission than accept them, and they have to figure out a way to, take out loans or whatever to come here. So that's the other thing that happens out in shaping process for those institutions that are need aware.
We just, as you were telling that story, we had a question from the audience that says exactly that. Does how much financial aid you need or don't need affect your chances? In this case, the question is at all if the school names itself as need blind. So
if it names itself, if it's need blind, then financial aid is not supposed to come into consideration during the admissions process. Clearly, so at Emory, Davidson, they're need blind. There's certain things obviously they know in the process, right? They know your zip code, they know what your parents do, right? So there's these things that you can't hide, but they're not taking it into consideration. Now, there's a key difference between need blind and meets full need and need blind and doesn't meet full need, right? So you could be an institution like Davidson or Emory and they're need blind in admissions and they promise to meet your full need as defined by federal or institutional formulas. But there's a lot more institutions out there who are need blind in admissions, and then they'll send you a financial aid offer and you'll look at it and you'll be like, there's no way I can afford to go to this place. So they accepted you, they were need blind,
right.
But then they don't give you enough money to actually come there.
Right. And I think that, as I said earlier, is one of the pieces that's increased so many students' applications is that the financial aid process has become less predictable over the years.
That's why personally, I actually like institutions that are need aware, because if you can't be need blind and meet full need, to me, the next best thing is to be need aware, because why try to accept students who really can't afford you? Because then what happens is that emotional tug, that emotional pull pulls you in and you end up stretching in a way that is just not good for anybody.
Or we are saying to an 18-year-old, we think you have the maturity and capacity to understand the loans that you are signing up for, the decision you are making. And that is a complex argument to make as well. So, so in some ways, I think the transparency of need aware does at least help everybody know where they stand. So on that note, we have about 4 minutes. Tell us something delightful that happened during your time in college admissions. And we can all take with us to remember that this is human and kids do go to college and there's great spots everywhere.
Well, first of all, the students that I followed, some of them, in fact, many of them never got into their quote unquote dream college. But you want to know what? They're going somewhere. They're going somewhere that was on their list. For the most part, they're happy, right? So the students that I followed who were happiest at the end of their process really looked at it as a growth. They learned something about themselves. They were willing to be changed during the process. That dream college might have changed during the process, but they ended up going somewhere and going to one of their schools that was on their list. So it's not as bad as everybody makes it seem to be, as long as I think you have a reasonable list to start with. That's on that side. And then on the other side, I got to know great admissions counselors. And one of the things I'm really sorry about in the book is that, I spent time with so many of them, breakfast, dinner, drinks, everything. And I unfortunately didn't get to profile enough of them in the book. They're human. They're just like us. They're great people. They came into this with an incredible passion for helping students, sometimes just like them when they were 18. And then they come up against institutional priorities, right? They need more full pay students. They need a third baseman for the baseball team. They need more people from North Dakota, right? That is something that is being told to them on high, and they have to fulfill that. And so their will to want to get somebody in sometimes comes up against that reality of the situation, but they're trying their best, and they're, for the most part, people that are reasonable and helpful, and I think that's particularly true right now, and encourage people to use them, right? To encourage students and parents to reach out to them and use them, because by the way, we're all going through this process right now. This is not something, COVID-19 is not something that's just affecting 18-year-olds, right? It's also affecting these institutional leaders and these institutions too. So we all kind of get this.
right? The director of admissions at Tulane was recently quoted as saying, "I have postponed my wedding 4 times."
Right.
I understand. I understand what havoc this is creating. And you know, it's an interesting role because to be an effective admissions officer, typically you are someone who is incredibly thoughtful, incredibly caring, incredibly positive, super enthusiastic, and then also so often painted with this incredibly negative brush. And so we want to remember that there are real people doing real things, and we call them counselors for a reason.
Yes, exactly.
Well, Jeffrey, thank you so much. This was really just so much fun. I could talk with you about college admissions for many, many hours, but I know that our time is over. So huge thank you to everyone who joined us tonight, and Jeff especially for leading us in such a great conversation. I am sure you are all now just as intrigued as I was. So if you'd like a copy of Jeff's new book being released in September, go to jeffselingo.com/purchase and use the code BOOK30 at checkout for a 30% discount. Our next town hall takes place 2 weeks from now on Wednesday, September 2nd at 7 p.m. And it will be led by our educational planning director, Jeff Knox, presenting a panel of students sharing their real life stories from the application process through heading off to college at William & Mary, Haverford, and Georgetown. So I know there's nothing I like more than hearing students talk and share their own stories and speak for themselves. So it should be a great night. Look forward to seeing you then. Have a great evening.
Good night, everybody.